Hey everyone, welcome back to a new GME video. So as you can see from the first view on the screen is that the monthly trigger has finally turned bullish. Now, bullish is great. It means that the monthly trigger will now act as support rather than the resistance that it did back here. And even though price moved up through the monthly trigger, it was brought back down while still in the month of May. And as we discussed in multiple videos before here, May was never a good setup for a melt up because the monthly velocity was still negative. But now that it flipped positive, we are one step closer to a summer melt up for GME. Now, the monthly is bullish. It will turn strong bullish only once the weekly trigger, which is currently at 1595, crosses above the monthly trigger. Now, the faster and the higher price goes, the quicker the weekly trigger will be able to cross above the monthly trigger. If price drifts around in the 20s to 30s, it will probably take about 8 weeks, judging by the way the trigger went from 1543 to 1595 this past week with very little movement. If GME has a little bit more upside, we can see this move $1 per week, and that would take about 5 to 8 weeks. So without further ado, let's jump into some previous melt-ups to, kind of learn what we should be expecting in the future should that bullish crossover happen. So I made a tweet about this a couple of, I think it was in the beginning of the week, where I showed, what triggers a melt up. And in that tweet, I showed GME way back in 2020, where if you'll notice, we see a few key steps happen. And the steps are: one, price breaks above the monthly trigger. That's the first key step to the start of a melt up. The second step right here is the hourly trigger crossing above the monthly trigger. And the third step is the daily trigger crossing above the monthly trigger. And you'll notice that when the daily trigger does cross above the monthly trigger, there is a very nice upside move that followed. And so we can reasonably expect something similar in the coming week or two, now that the daily trigger has actually crossed above the monthly trigger ever so slightly by 1 penny. You can see daily trigger is 2059, monthly trigger is 2058. Here's the daily trigger. You can see it crossing above. So as it crosses above, we would expect another sharp increase in price for GME, maybe a move to the 30s or so before further consolidation. But the daily trigger crossing above the monthly trigger is definitely bullish, and we can more than likely expect a nice upside move as that happens. Now, it might take another couple of days for it to really get above the monthly trigger. Right now, it's kind of at the monthly trigger. But again, it would be very normal to see another huge candle like this. Now, this candle was actually 45% move, and it peaked at a 69% move. So that would look like this in current day and age and prices. So let's do 45%. So 45% move would take it to about 33, and 69% just about 39. So reasonably, we can expect once the daily trigger crosses the monthly trigger to have some kind of move like this. Definitely wouldn't be out of the ordinary at all. And should GME be able to get this type of move, it will bring the weekly trigger up above the monthly trigger much faster than GME just consolidating sideways for the next 2 months. So that's one piece of good news. And then, of course, the third and final step to a major market melt up is getting that weekly trigger either very close to the monthly trigger or through the monthly trigger. That's this right here. And once that crossover happens, that's when the melt up is already set in motion. All the algos are bullish on all time frames, and that's when we can expect a major, massive increase in price for GME. Now, we'll show another example of the same melt up formation forming with AMC back in June 2021. Now, I was able to take well advantage of this melt up. This was actually the biggest trade of my life, biggest options trade of my life. So, very familiar with this setup, and I look for it all the time in various stocks. So again, we see that same thing where price went through the monthly trigger while monthly velocity was still quite negative. As you can see here, monthly velocity was still negative when price tried to break through the monthly trigger, so price was brought back down. but then after bouncing at the weekly trigger, it was able to pop back above, and you got the first kind of step of the melt up, which is price crossing above the monthly trigger. You can see the hourly trigger crossing above the monthly trigger as well. So that's steps 1 and 2. And then you had the daily trigger crossing above the monthly trigger. And again, we see that same pop higher where the daily trigger crosses the monthly trigger. So, it happens kind of at the same time, maybe a drop later, a drop earlier. And then as the weekly trigger gets really close to the monthly trigger, that's when we see this major melt up. And here price happened to, start exploding as the weekly trigger got close. It hadn't crossed above yet. It was getting there, and price just went straight up even without the crossover. So it doesn't necessarily have to cross over. It really just has to hang above the monthly trigger long enough for the weekly trigger to get really close to confirm that breakout. Now, it happens to be that this does look a lot more similar to where GME is trading right now than GME itself back in 2020. If we look back at GME, we'll see something very similar. Now, I'm not comparing fractals or comparing patterns or anything like that. It's just hard to deny the similarities. We had a major pop in price, kind of like AMC had in January 2021. Price was brought back down, got a nice bounce off the weekly trigger, now climbing back above the hourly trigger, daily trigger crossover right here. And, I would expect like some sort of nice move higher here to allow the weekly trigger to climb and climb and climb. And then maybe sometime in July, of course, earlier the better, but, taking all other variables out of the equation, like earnings or the options chain or anything like that, just what I would expect normally in this kind of circumstance is, a nice move higher to allow the weekly trigger to come closer and closer and closer to the monthly trigger. And then once it gets close enough, that's when I would expect some kind of melt up. So, if we just do something like that, you could see it looks like sometime in late July. Now, I do want to share another scenario that is possible where everything happens a lot sooner than, I've been kind of talking about in the past few videos. And if you look at apps right here, this was a incredible move. You can see the breakout above the monthly trigger here and a 6,000% upside move. So again, anything's possible in the financial markets. Don't let anybody tell you what price is realistic, what price isn't realistic. Apps was able to pump almost 7,000% after breaking above its monthly trigger and completing the melt up setup. So again, very important not to let anybody tell you what's possible and what's not possible. So if we dive into this, I'm going to keep it on the weekly time frame because otherwise it's going to take me a while to get there. But you can see that instead of having like one crossover and then another, it all pretty much happened at the same time. Price broke above the monthly trigger, and then the next week you had the hourly trigger cross above, and then a couple of weeks later you had the daily trigger cross above, and then shortly after you had the weekly trigger cross above. So price broke above the monthly trigger on first week of November, and the weekly trigger crossed above the monthly trigger towards the end of December. So this was about, let's just get it exact, about 7 weeks, about 50 days. So if we go back to GME, here's price breaking above the monthly trigger, and here is that same 50 days. So again, also looks like early July. And this has been actually my main point in previous videos. I've made 3 videos about this already. And in each video, I made sure to stress that it does seem like people are expecting a lot to happen very quickly. But I've been watching meltup setups happen for a very long time now. And I can say that when meltups above the monthly trigger begin, there's usually one huge burst above the monthly trigger. And then if price can consolidate and hold above the monthly trigger for long enough for these lower time frame crosses, that's what triggers a meltup. Not immediately, doesn't happen off the bat. Meltup setups take a while to form as things fall into place, which is currently what we're seeing here with GME. And once everything falls into place, that's when price can explode hundreds of percents to the upside. That's what a meltup is, hundreds of percent, not a double, not a triple, 500, 1,000% move to the upside. Like we said, our expectation for this meltup is at least a move well into the hundreds. End of summer, whenever it happens. But once the meltup begins, once the weekly trigger crosses above the monthly trigger, whether it happens early July, whether it happens earlier, whether it happens a bit later, end of July, September time, But however long it takes the weekly trigger to rise, that will depend on how high price can move up over the next couple of weeks. But whenever that does happen, we're not just expecting, just a stint, just a push higher. We're expecting a real melt up. So again, well into the hundreds, 200s. And then as the triggers continue rising, they will act as support, and price will be able to go on a bull run for many, many years to come. Hopefully, that's what we're looking for. Now, of course, invalidation for this entire thing and the meltup scenario would be invalidated if price breaks right below the weekly trigger. Now, of course, that is not forecasted, that is not expected, but it's important to understand the invalidation for the meltup and the validation for the meltup, which would be the weekly trigger crossing above the monthly trigger. So if this video is helpful for you guys, I would greatly appreciate if you can like the video, maybe share it with some friends or family, people that you think would find it interesting. Otherwise, I'll continue updating the progress on Twitter. You can follow me for more frequent updates. I try to tweet when breakouts happen or when price is bottoming. And I'll be making videos every week on Sunday until price is well into the hundreds. So have a great rest of your week, everybody.